The ballroom of the Harrington Plaza Hotel glittered like a crown jewel. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over elegantly dressed men and women, their laughter mixing with the soft hum of a live jazz quartet. Adrian Blackwood stood at the centre of it all, yet somehow apart. His dark, tailored suit hung perfectly on his broad shoulders, the subtle gleam of a platinum watch peeking out from his cuff as he swirled the champagne flute in his hand. Around him, a sea of sycophants buzzed, vying for his attention. Adrian was the face of modern success, a tech billionaire who had built an empire from scratch. Yet tonight, as he scanned the room, all he saw were masks, people eager to impress, flatter, and gain something from him. He could predict every conversation, every fake laugh. It was exhausting. And then he saw her. At first glance, Lily Carter didn't belong. She wasn't adorned in a designer gown, nor did she drape herself in jewels like the other women in the room. Her long auburn hair was swept into a simple ponytail, and her black dress, though neat, was plain and modest. She wasn't a guest, she was a waitress. She carried a tray of empty champagne flutes with ease, weaving through the glittering crowd with her head held high. There was something striking about her, not her appearance, but the way she moved, her unyielding posture, her quiet dignity. She didn't look at anyone like they were above her, despite the obvious disparity in wealth. Adrian found himself watching her, intrigued. She must have felt his gaze because their eyes met briefly. Hers, a warm hazel, didn't flicker with the usual awe or intimidation he was used to. She looked at him for a moment, then simply turned away, continuing her work. Adrian's curiosity was piqued. It wasn't until later that night, when the gala was winding down and the crowd had thinned, that their paths truly crossed. Lily was in a quiet corner of the ballroom, resting for a moment as she adjusted her aching feet in the cheap heels she'd worn to work. Adrian approached her, his polished Oxford shoes making barely a sound on the carpeted floor. "Tough night?" he asked, his deep voice startling her. She looked up, startled at first, but then her eyes narrowed slightly. "Not tougher than usual," she said, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I'll survive." Adrian smiled faintly. "I'm Adrian Blackwood." "I know," she said, without a trace of reverence. "Your name's on the building." She gestured toward the massive windows where the Harrington Plaza logo gleamed against the city skyline. Her directness caught him off guard, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. People didn't talk to him like this, casually, without trying to impress or flatter him. "And you are?" he asked. "Lily Carter," she said simply. She gave him a small, polite smile before starting to move away, clearly intending to get back to her duties. But Adrian wasn't ready to let the conversation end. "Do you always make a habit of putting billionaires in their place?" Lily paused, raising an eyebrow. "Do billionaires always make a habit of bothering waitresses?" The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Touché." She studied him for a moment, unsure of his intentions, but something in his expression, an openness she hadn't expected, made her stay. "All right, Mr. Blackwood, what do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms. He leaned casually against the wall, still holding his champagne flute, though it was nearly empty. "Honestly, a real conversation, something this room seems incapable of offering." Lily tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "And you think I can provide that?" "You've already proven you can," he said. She shook her head, amused but skeptical. "All right, fine, let's talk. But if you want a real conversation, then let's skip the small talk." Her eyes met his again, steady and unflinching. "What's it like, being a billionaire?" Adrian chuckled softly, surprised by her boldness. "It's complicated. Everyone thinks it's all yachts and private jets, and to some extent it is, but it can also be isolating. When you're at the top, it's hard to tell who's with you because they care and who's with you because they want something." Her expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of skepticism. "Poor little billionaire," she said, though her tone wasn't cruel. "Try living in a shelter, where the only thing people want from you is to not take the last piece of bread." Adrian straightened, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. "A shelter?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yeah, that's where I'm going after this. I work doubles when I can, but it's not enough to afford rent in this city, so I make do." There was no self-pity in her voice, only matter-of-fact honesty. For the first time in years, Adrian was at a loss for words. He had spent his life surrounded by unimaginable wealth, living in a bubble where struggle was a foreign concept. Lily's reality was worlds away from his, and yet she carried herself with more grace and strength than most people he knew. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate. Lily shrugged. "Don't be. It's life. You play the hand you're dealt." They stood in silence for a moment, the glittering ballroom around them feeling like a different planet. Then Adrian spoke again. "I'd like to help." Her eyes narrowed. "Help how? Write a check? Start a foundation in my name?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't just pretend I didn't hear what you told me." She sighed, shaking her head. "Look, I'm not a charity case, Adrian. I appreciate the sentiment, but I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I don't need saving." Adrian stepped closer, his voice soft but insistent. "I don't think you need saving, Lily, but maybe I do." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, her guarded expression faltering for the first time. "What do you mean?" "For years, I've surrounded myself with people who only care about what I can give them. And in one night, you've shown me more authenticity and strength than I've seen in a lifetime. You've reminded me that there's more to life than this." He gestured around the room. "Maybe I need to learn how to see the world the way you do." Lily studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of condescension or pity, but all she saw was sincerity. "I think that's something you'll have to figure out on your own," she said finally. "But if you're serious, start by listening to people who don't live in your world. You'd be surprised how much you can learn." Lily left the gala that night, slipping into the cold, dark streets and heading back to the shelter. Adrian watched her go, a strange ache in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt as though the walls around him had cracked, letting in the faintest glimmer of light. In the weeks that followed, Adrian couldn't get Lily out of his mind. Her strength, her honesty, her refusal to be anything other than herself. It was a stark contrast to the shallow, materialistic world he had built around himself. Slowly, he began to make changes. He visited shelters, spoke to people whose lives were nothing like his own, and began funding initiatives that addressed the root causes of homelessness, not just the symptoms. As for Lily, she kept working, kept fighting, but every so often she would receive a small note or gesture, an anonymous donation to her shelter, a handwritten letter of gratitude. She didn't need to ask who it was from. Adrian and Lily's paths crossed again months later, in the most unexpected way. But that's a story for another time, one of love, redemption, and two worlds colliding in the most extraordinary way.